Yeah, so thanks very much for the introduction and to the organisers for the invitation to speak here this week. It's my first time here, so it's a pleasure. So as the title says, I'm going to talk about conditioned exit measures for non-local branching processes, and I'll explain each of these terms eventually. And this is joint work with Simon Harris, who's in Auckland, and Christopher Dean and Andreas Cipriani, who are both also in Warwick and in the audience today. So I'll first talk about some of the motivation as to why we're interested in this project, first of all. So the motivation comes from looking at particular rare events that can occur for neutron transport. So neutron transport describes how neutrons move around in nuclear reactors or other fissile media. And from a probabilistic perspective, we can think about nuclear fission as a branching piecewise deterministic Markov process. Now, what can happen in nuclear reactors is that over time there's wear and tear, change in temperature, change in pressure, and small cracks can appear in the boundary of the reactor or the interface between materials. And of course, the nuclear engineers want to know what's the risk associated with these cracks appearing. And so one of the things that they want to try to estimate is the probability that a neutron moving through this fissile media will eventually make it to this crack. Now, of course, one thing that you could do is just do naive Monte Carlo and simulate lots and lots of independent copies of a branching piecewise deterministic Markov process with the correct dynamics, count the number of neutrons that hit these cracks, and then estimate the associated probability. But since this is a rare event, of course, there are not going to be many neutrons that actually do this, and therefore this is quite inefficient. In order to see a good estimate of this probability, you'll need many, many copies of your simulation. So the idea of this project is to come up with more efficient simulation methods to try to better estimate this probability with lower computational cost. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a step back and consider a much simpler problem. So I'm going to, first of all, forget about branching for now. And I'm going to consider the same kinds of questions, but just when I have a Markov process moving through some domain, and then I'm estimating the probability that it hits a particular part of the domain. So in particular, I've got this kind of picture in mind, and I know it's almost as good as Matt Roberts' pictures from yesterday. But the idea is that this is the kind of model that I'm interested in. So I have a particle source here, this red ball. I have a detector up here, and I'm interested in the probability that a Markov process moving through this domain will hit the detector. And in particular, these black boxes here are absorbing. So as soon as a particle hits this, it will be killed and no longer evolve. And so this then becomes quite a difficult path to try to achieve. And as with branching processes, you can just simulate many, many copies of the underlying Markov process and count the number of them that hit this detector, but this is not very efficient. Another thing that you might do is say, well, why don't I construct the law of the process conditioned to hit this reactor? And you could do that, and you could do a martingale change of measure and then simulate precisely these paths that are conditioned to hit the detector. But of course, in order to construct this martingale, I need to know the probability that I hit this detector, which is what I'm trying to compute in the first place. So this is also not quite possible. Now, luckily, some people in the sequential Monte Carlo community have developed a nice interacting particle system type method called adaptive multi-level splitting that addresses these kinds of problems. So adaptive multi-level splitting is defined as follows. So the input is I choose n, some natural number, and this is going to be the number of particles in my system that I'm going to be simulating. I'm also going to choose or define an importance function on the domain, and this is to kind of give me a score associated to my trajectories. And then there's also a final level L max, which is going to be used to tell me whether I've hit my detector or not. Okay, so the algorithm tells me that I should simulate n independent copies of my Markov process until they're absorbed. Now, absorption here could mean that they've hit the detector or that they've actually been absorbed in one of these black boxes in the previous picture. And then for each of these trajectories, I'm going to compute its score. And this is defined as the supremum of the importance function along its path. And then what I'm going to do is order these scores into increasing order, so I'll relabel them, and set L to be this lowest score. Now, in the case that L is less than L max, this means that I still have some trajectories that have not yet hit my detector. So in this situation, I'm going to take Xi1, which is the trajectory associated with this lowest score. I'll delete it, and then uniformly choose one of the remaining trajectories in the system. And then with this chosen trajectory, I'm going to clone it from its initial position up until the first time that its importance exceeds the level L, which is guaranteed by construction. And then from that point, I'm going to simulate an independent copy of the Markov process until absorption. And then I'm going to go back, compute the scores or the score of this new particle, reorder them, and then keep going until all my particles have hit the detector Lmax. So in pictures, what's happening? So here, if I go back to my problem that I was considering before, I'm going to fix n is equal to 3. And my importance function I'm going to define to be some sort of distance from the detector. So in particular, trajectories that get closer to the detector will have a higher score associated to them. So I simulate 3 independent copies of my Markov process. I compute the score associated to each one, and I take the current level L, which I denote by this orange line, to be the one with the lowest score, or the lowest score. And so we can see this trajectory is the associated trajectory with that lowest score, so I delete it from my simulation. And then I uniformly choose one of the remaining ones, so suppose I choose this guy here. So I'm going to clone it from this position all the way up until it reaches level L, and then from this point I'm just going to glue on an independent copy of the Markov process. So I end up with something like this. And then I repeat, and eventually you'll get paths that all hit the detector. So the advantages of adaptive multi-level splitting is that you always have n particles, so in some sense you can control the computational cost associated with your simulations. And after m iterations, you can just approximate the probability of hitting the detector by counting the number of particles that have reached the detector, so I've denoted this R, normalizing, and then multiplying by this weight, which is just compensating for the fact that you've introduced a bias at each resampling event when a particle has been deleted. And then the resulting paths are then an approximation of the Markov process conditioned to hit this detector. So now if I go back to the problem that's with branching, we want to try to do a very similar thing. So there was a PhD student back in 2017 who did start to look at this in the context of neutron transport. And so in this thesis, there is a chapter that's devoted to branching AMS for neutron transport. But one of the problems is identifying a good importance function. Now, again, back in the scenario where I'm just considering Markov processes and not branching systems, the optimal importance function is going to be associated to the martingale that I would use to change measure to get the conditioned path to hit the detector. And as I said, I can't use this martingale, but this gives me some insight as to maybe what functions I might choose as my importance function. So what we want to do is try to do the same thing and try to understand the behavior of the underlying branching process conditioned to hit my detector or certain areas of my domain, to try to use this to then inform what the importance function of my branching AMS should be. So I'll now just spend maybe a few minutes defining the precise class of branching processes that I'm going to be working with. Okay, so my class of non-local branching processes, I'm going to, for now, take the state space D to be a subset of Rn, which is open and bounded with some nice boundary. You can generalize this, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. But for now, we'll assume this is the state space. And I'm going to assume that particles move around in this space D according to some Markov process Xi, whose law, when initiated from a position X, is given by this bold P. And it moves around in D until the point that it hits the boundary, which is at the time of its lifetime zeta, and at this point it's absorbed, so I'm assuming killing boundary conditions. And then when a particle is at position X, At rate beta x, a branching event occurs, and at this point, the parent particle is replaced by a bunch of new particles. And this is done according to a point process, which I've denoted curly z, whose law is px, which again depends on the position of the parent particle. And in particular, positions of my offspring x1 up to xn can be scattered everywhere in my domain D. So they don't have to be at the same position as the parent particle, and so this is what I mean by a non-local branching process in this case. And then similarly to, as we saw yesterday, I'm going to let xit be the location or the position of the ith particle alive at time t. And then the branching process is just defined as a collection of measures by putting the Dirac mass at each of these positions and adding them up. And I'll also use the notation for a measure mu and a function f. I'll write mu square bracket f to be the integral of f with respect to the measure mu over the domain D. Okay, so some assumptions that I'll assume are in place throughout. So I'm going to assume that the underlying Markov process, the motion of the particles, admits a Cadillac modification. So this is really just to ensure that I can use relevant martingale results. I'm going to assume that the branching rate is uniformly bounded over the domain. And this is, again, just to ensure that I've got a finite number of events in finite time intervals. The third one is that I'll assume that the branching process is subcritical or critical. And again, I can work with supercritical processes, and I'll talk about that later on. But for now, I'll assume that I have a subcritical or critical process, and this is to ensure that I have extinction almost surely. And then the final one is for some value of k, I'm going to assume k moments on the offspring distribution. And the value of k should become clear as to what that is and when, and I'll try to remember to point that out specifically. Okay. And then the final thing that I want to sort of introduce is a slight modification to the branching process x that I introduced in the previous slide. So I'm going to modify it in a slightly different way that allows me to keep track of particles that have exited my domain D. So I'm going to let xd with a superscript d denote the process that behaves as the branching process x in the domain D, but when particles hit the boundary and would have become absorbed there, I'm going to freeze the particles and I'm going to keep those keep track of those locations in this process xt.
But I assume your special motion has continuous sample path, otherwise it wouldn't hit the boundary.
So you can do that. If you jump, you can somehow consider the boundary to be everything outside of the domain. Yeah. So, yeah, if you want to just consider the edge, then yes, continuous. Otherwise, you have to modify the notion of boundary. And then I'll use this sort of slight abuse of notation. X infinity d is going to denote the exit measure, and that's all of the measure associated to all of the particles that have ever been frozen on the boundary. And I've just put a brief reference for more information on these sort of exit Markov systems. Okay, so now we have the branching process that I'm going to work with, and this sort of stopped process. I'll now define or talk about the problem where I'm conditioning one or at least one particle to exit in a single point. So this is kind of the simpler problem, and then we'll go on to the sort of the full gory details of all exiting at lots of different points later on. Okay, so this is the type of problem I have in mind. So I've got my domain D, I've got a branching process inside the domain, and there's some point D naught denoted by this red cross. Where I'm really interested in the probability that at least one particle hits this point here. So typically this will be a point or even a small epsilon ball in the boundary. Okay. So if I take a step back from this problem and think about other ways that I could condition my branching process, well, one thing that I could do with subcritical or critical processes is to look at the problem of conditioning on survival. This is quite a common problem. And it's well known that associated to this problem is a martingale change of measure that yields something called a spine decomposition. And this allows you, under this new measure, to decompose your process into a special biased particle called the spine that's conditioned to survive forever, dressed with independent copies of the underlying branching process. Now, while that's sort of conditioned on survival, I want to think of it in some sense as conditioning it to hit a point infinity in time-space. So then if I now transfer back to my problem, all I'm asking is that a particle hits a particular point. So why should I not be able to use very similar techniques and find a change of measure under which I can do a very similar or an analogous decomposition? So this first lemma here gives me a way to construct a martingale so that I can change measure and I can indeed look at the process under this new measure. So this lemma says that if you give me a function v star that's bounded and non-negative on my domain D, and all I ask is that on the boundary it's equal to the indicator of hitting this point D naught. And then I'm going to feed it through the exit measure and take the expectation. I'm going to define v1 of x to be precisely this right-hand side. And this delta of x is saying I start with a single particle at x. Then it's quite straightforward to show. It's kind of a follow-your-nose proof that if I take the expectation of the stopped or the frozen process at time t under v1, then it's precisely equal to v1 of x. And I preserve this boundary type condition as well. Okay. So the idea behind this lemma is that V1 is sort of assigning an importance to locations, and it tells me how much, if I was to sort of start a branching process at this position, how much mass it will contribute to D naught at the end. Okay. So we know then, as I said, from this lemma, we have a martingale. It's given by Wt of 1. And so I'm going to change measure, and this measure I'm going to denote Q1. And we're interested in what the process xd looks like under this new measure. Okay, so under Q1, xd can be constructed as follows. So if I start with an initial configuration of points, x1 through to xn, I'm going to select particle I star with a probability that's proportional to its score according to V1. And this specially chosen particle will be marked the spine, so I've denoted it in red here. And all the other non-marked particles are going to initiate independent copies of my underlying frozen or stopped branching process. Now, the special particle that is marked the spine is going to behave in a biased way. So it's going to move according to this semigroup that I've given here, ST. And there are sort of two types of biasing that are involved in, or two elements of the biasing that are involved in this semigroup. So first, there's a ratio here of V1 of psi t divided by V1 of x, my initial position. So this ratio here is biasing me to move into positions that are more favorable than my previous position. So if my future direction psi t has a higher score and therefore more likely to hit D naught than my initial position, then that ratio is going to be more than 1, and so it's going to assign more mass and more importance to these paths. Similarly, I have an exponential term here, and if I look at this ratio here, this is the first moment of my offspring distribution under the action of V1. So again, if my offspring are fitter than me, if I were to give birth at that point, then again, this ratio is going to be greater than 1. This potential is going to be positive, and therefore that exponential term is going to assign more mass to these paths and more importance to these paths. And conversely, if my future directions, or if I was to branch at that point and my offspring or future direction were less favorable, then I would have a penalization of these paths, as they would have less importance. When the spine is then at position X, it also undergoes branching, but it does so again at a modified rate. So the new rate is the same as the old rate beta of x, but again biased by a ratio. And this is the same kind of motivation. If at this point my offspring would be fitter than me, I'm going to branch at a faster rate. And if they're less fit than me, then I'm going to branch at a much slower rate. If I do branch at this point, I'm going to bias, I'm going to tilt my offspring distribution. And again, this is going to be sort of favouring fitter or more particles in fitter areas and so on. And then all I do is that when I've then produced my offspring, I select one of the I go back to step one and select one of the particles to then inherit the mark of this spine. And this probability that I choose this mark is again proportional to the importance function, the score V1. So in the end, I end up with under Q1, this new measure, my process behaves as this special tagged particle that carries a mark that is conditioned to hit my point or my epsilon ball D0 dressed with independent copies of the original underlying branching process. Okay. And so then from the practical perspective, we can say, well, now I have a process that I really know how it behaves. I know that it hits the detector. I can now do computation under this measure and then transfer this back to the original measure via the change of measure. Okay, but what now in a sort of more realistic situation, what if I was interested in hitting at multiple points, exiting my domain at multiple points? So in this case, I had a single marked particle, but now if I want to exit at k marks, I have to have, sorry, let me start again. If I want to exit at k points, I'm going to have to sort of enhance things a bit further and say, now I'm interested in k marks. How do these k marks propagate through the branching process in order to ensure that I have a subtree that does exit precisely at these k points? So just to, again, to have a picture in mind, I've got my domain D. I have 5 crosses here, which I should have labeled D1 to D5, and this is where I'm interested in having my branching exit through these points. So the moral of the story is pretty much the same. So I won't give all of the precise details of the martingales and so on because it's just actually a bit of a mess. But I'll just talk through the steps and then I'll give a picture as to precisely what's going on here. So we start off again with constructing our importance functions V1 up to Vk. So if you give me some general non-negative bounded functions on the domain V1 star up to Vk star, that satisfy the boundary condition that the ith one is equal to the indicator of the point or the exit point di, then I'll feed these through the exit measure as per lemma 1, and these will give me back sort of eigenfunctions of some sort, V1 up to Vk, that preserve these boundary conditions. I'll then use these functions V1 up to Vk to construct a martingale WTK. And then again, I'll define a change of measure, and this new measure I'll denote Qk, and we're interested in what does the process look like under this measure Qk. Now, as I said before, Matt's simulations are much, much better than mine, so I did steal this from his paper with Simon. So this is coming from a sort of multiple spine picture conditioned on survival. But again, as I said, the moral of the story in time or space is pretty much the same. So I'll explain what's going on here and then try to indicate where the differences are between the two scenarios. So here, this problem is looking at exiting at 7 points on my domain, and that's why I've got this particle with a 7 attached to it. So if I start with my special biased particle, this will carry marks 1 through to 7. Okay? And the biasing associated to this particle will be such that it takes into account which marks I'm carrying. So this is the first discrepancy between the biasing when I condition on survival and the biasing when I condition to exit at points, is that when I condition on survival, the biasing here doesn't see how many marks or which marks I'm carrying, but in this case it really does because my particle needs to split in order to exit at all of these points. As before, this special particle will branch at a modified rate that again depends on which marks I'm carrying. There will also be a tilted offspring distribution, and then there will be my new particles, my daughter particles, that I need to decide who then becomes special among these daughter particles. Now, what happens at this point is that the marks are assigned in a way that means that configurations of marks among these particles that are more likely to lead to the events that I want, i.e. exiting at my points D1 up to D7, are more probable. So here you can kind of think of an example where perhaps over here I've got exit points 1, 2, and 3. Somewhere here I've got exit points 4, 5, and 6, and somewhere over here I've got exit point 7. And so marks 1, 2, and 3 will be more likely to follow the green particle. Marks 4, 5, and 6 will be more likely to follow the red particle, and mark 7 is more likely to follow the yellow particle, because that will mean that my subsequent tree is more likely to exit at the points that I want them to. And again, these particles, because they're marked, will move in a biased motion, and the biasing will be in such a way that it's not just that I care about how many marks I carry, it's which marks I carry. So in particular, the biasing on the green particle will be different to the biasing on the red particle. And so we repeat these steps again and again. And as before, if I have a branching event and only one of my offspring, or fewer than the number of offspring I have marks, the non-marked particles will just initiate independent copies of the underlying branching process. And so then I also end up with a picture where I have a branching process with that can be decomposed into a subtree of particles that are conditioned to exit at my points that I want them to, dressed with independent copies of the underlying process. Okay, so some comments on sort of generalizing this, and then future steps towards the actual practical application that we're interested in. So we can generalize this to other exit measures, other conditioning, and so on. So I don't have to take D to be a subset of Rn that's open and bounded. I could take a much more general state space and consider exiting from a subdomain or something like this. I also I don't have to exit from the boundary of a set. It could be that I'm interested in hitting a detector, as I was in the first pictures. All I need to do is then modify this notion of stopped process, or the exit measure. And I could do much more wacky conditioning. I could say I want 5 particles over here, I want at least 2 particles over here, and I want at least 20 particles over here. And all that would do is change the martingale to have a combinatorial factor that would take account of this. So I assumed that the process was subcritical or critical, so we could treat supercritical processes as well. So this assumption was just to ensure that the exit measure was well defined, but I could treat supercritical processes as long as I only consider the exit measure up to a finite time. Okay, and then from a more practical perspective, lemma 1 I think really is the key to tell me how to construct importance functions from AMS. So as I was saying with the Markov process, you could tell me, well, why don't you just construct the underlying branching process that's really conditioned to hit this detector? Well, the problem is I can't compute, I can't really get my hands on, except for in simple cases, the probability that I will hit the detector, because that's what I'm interested in, and therefore I can't construct the precise martingale that would lead to the underlying branching process conditioned on hitting the detector. So lemma 1 gives me a class of different martingales that allow me to develop or to construct a process that is related to the original process that does end up with some conditioning, but maybe not in the optimal way. And so then the idea is, are there certain functions V star such that when I feed them through the exit measure, they give me tractable functions V1 that I could then use to construct tractable martingales and therefore importance functions for my branching AMS. And another question I was discussing with Chris yesterday, well, if we have a nice enough function, a tractable enough martingale in the first place, could we just simulate directly the underlying process without going through this whole AMS procedure? So that's sort of what we'll start looking at next. Some open questions. So the motivation, the inspiration for this technique came from this paper by Salisbury and Versani that looked at precisely this problem for conditioned exit measures for super Brownian motion. So one question is, could this be done for more general super processes and with possibly non-local branching. And then a couple more vague questions that I haven't sort of really put too much thought into, but if I think back to the time-dependent case, as we saw in Renming's talk yesterday, you could take a critical branching process, condition on survival till time t, renormalized by t, and then you get a limit in distribution to an exponential random variable. And as we've seen here, the techniques for conditional on survival and conditional on these spatial problems are really transferable. So is there some notion of Yaglom limit here? I'm not sure what it would be or what it would look like, but it feels like there should be. And then also, you know, what can you say about the genealogical structure of these decomposed processes? So just a few useful references. So some on exit measures, some on the more Monte Carlo techniques that I've talked about, and then on other many to few and multiple splines type results. And I'll finish there, and thank you very much for your attention.